Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. So, as it is with so many of Jesus's agricultural parables, when you have a priest that is going to stand up to preach a sermon on this, you really want somebody like Tom Reeder, who has spent a lot of time on a farm, and not somebody like me, who kills every plant that I've ever touched in my life. I don't get things about agriculture or agronomy or even just household gardening very much. But today I actually think I might be exactly the target for this parable. To explain to you just how bad I am at these things, I'll just briefly tell you, I've thought about there are a lot of different stories about how I've killed plants and done poorly, but I think one of them is particularly appropriate. When Casey and I got married, we didn't know anything about green things, and that included plants and money, by the way. And we left and we went to New York, and we basically sold everything that we owned because we were moving into 500 square feet. And as you might not be surprised to find out, we didn't learn anything about growing things in New York. We barely learned how to take care of a dog in New York. We came out of New York, though, and moved back to Savannah, Georgia. And there we rented this little 1940s bungalow that had a little tiny yard and a magnolia tree. It was perfect, little southern caricature. But it didn't have a garage, and we still didn't have any money, and had no way of taking care of this grass that we were now faced with. So like the first week that we were there, we went to a yard sale, and for $3, I bought an extension cord and an electric hedge trimmer. And I just want you to picture for a moment. We moved there in June. By July, every week I would come into my front yard with an extension cord coming out of my living room, through my mail slot, out to the outside, connected to another extension cord, and I was on the front, knelt down about like this, mowing down my grass with a hedge trimmer. Ingenious, you might say. Remington, you are brilliant. Brilliant enough to save up the $60 or whatever to buy a battery-operated string trimmer. Weed eater is what we call them in Jessup. So we got a weed eater, which meant that for 15 minutes at a time, I could cut swaths into my grass. I barely took care of it. The lawn kept winning for a long time. It kept winning until we left. But at some point, I was taking care of the grass kind of okay. And we had this row of azaleas between us and the neighbors. And they owned their property, so they were a little bit more particular than we were about how our yard looked. And our side of the azaleas was looking pretty poor. And in addition to that, we had these weeds that were growing between our driveway and the azaleas that were just horrendous looking. And actually made it hard to even park our cars without hearing that screeching sound of the stuff scraping against the side of our car whenever we came in. So, electric hedge trimmer and battery-operated string trimmer in hand, I went to town on these weeds and tore them apart. And as you might expect, those of you who know more about this sort of thing than I do, like a week later, they were back twice as large as they had been the week before, thrilled with me for my pruning. Thank you so much. We're finally happy. Well, like the lawn, the weeds kept winning. And they kept winning and they kept winning, and were doing so well that they started to bud and put on these beautiful, beautiful flowers. And Casey and I asked ourselves several times, what are these gorgeous flowers? This weed is incredible. Only to look it up later on and find out that this weed is called lantana, which is a pretty common, beautiful flowering plant that's also really beneficial to all sorts of insects. It was gorgeous. It was a weed we had determined because it was inconvenient for us where it was, because we didn't understand it, because I judged it. I'll be honest, up front, it has kind of an ugly textured leaf, and the stalk looked like every other weed that I had ever seen in my life. And it wasn't truly a weed. And once we found that out and let it flourish, we saw it for what it was. But I didn't have the eyes to see prior to that. So I think I am exactly the sort of person that Jesus is talking to today in this parable when he says that we don't have the eyes to see or the ability to take care of the sort of justice that God demands in God's own kingdom when it comes to allowing humans to flourish alongside people that we are quick to judge as weeds. We actually are pretty terrible at determining who is and who is not a weed, and are pretty quick to try to remove those who we call weeds in such a way that we actually do damage to all the rest of us as well. This past week, I finally got around to reading the book Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. I hope some of you know about it. If you don't have time to read the book, he did a TED Talk that's quite popular and quite good as well. Just Mercy is a tremendous book. It is a story about Brian Stevenson's own career, but told through the stories of the people he represented. He was a lawyer. He just got fresh out of law school and went to work in Atlanta for a defense team that went to serve people who had been wrongly accused of a crime and were sentenced to death in the South. And this is in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. He eventually started his own firm in Montgomery and would spend time representing especially poor or black persons in southern Alabama in similar circumstances. The stories that he tells are amazing. The points that he makes are incredible. He tells, on the one hand, the story of a man named Walter who had been sentenced to death for a crime that he very clearly did not commit. But pretty quickly in his case, somebody called him a weed. And once someone labeled him as a weed, everybody else only saw him as that. Never gave him a chance to see that, in fact, he wasn't at all. And so they sentenced him to death, and it began to perpetuate. So while the true wrong was that he was framed for a murder that he didn't commit, every additional wrong after that was a much smaller, simple misidentification based on prejudice, based on pride or ego, based on an inability to carry justice through, even if someone thought they were doing the right thing. Eventually, Brian Stevenson would get this man off of death row, but only after many, many years of his life had been lost, and he would be terrorized for the rest of his life by the abuse he suffered in prison, by the torture of having watched so many and smelled so many people be electrocuted while he awaited his own day to sit in the electric chair. That life would never be recovered, in spite of the fact that he did not ultimately end up being executed. A life was destroyed because we tried to separate the weeds from the wheat. We're not very good at this. For whatever reason, we just find ourselves unable to do it well. In my own life, I don't have any stories like the people that Brian Stevenson had to represent, from innocent people to people who were admittedly guilty of their crimes but had suffered such abuse as children or mental illness that surely they shouldn't be condemned to die in prison. To people who were innocent of their crimes but had been guilty of another crime and so had been labeled as a weed. And he tells the story of a woman who had given birth to a stillborn child, but because of her previous drug convictions, people assumed that she must have killed her child. And so she was sentenced to life without parole. Eventually, she would be released because of the work of Brian Stevenson. In my life, perhaps the person that I was quickest to label as a weed and never turn back from was the boss that I had at my last church, the priest who was my rector at my last church. Sam is his name, and when I got to Savannah, Sam left for quite some time. I just sort of handed me the keys to the church. I wasn't even a priest yet. Said, good luck. And when he returned, we had a struggle for quite some time, a struggle that eventually turned into an abusive relationship, where he would verbally abuse me in front of my peers, verbally abuse me on phone calls that he would make to me at 4 o'clock in the morning. At first, it was just Casey and myself living there, but eventually Casey was pregnant. I was pregnant the first time that Sam decided to threaten me with only 30 days to find a new job and get the hell out of his life. We somehow managed to get through that. Madeline was born, and only a little while later, after Sam had left for 2.5 months and sort of again said, good luck, he came back, and things had gone okay while he was gone, but he came back and was threatened, I think, by the fact that I managed to keep things together. And so I had some rapport with his congregation as he saw it. So one day I was having lunch in a park with other clergy friends, and he had been calling me that night before, but I had ignored him. And he called me that morning and said, I'm not even going to give you 30 days this time. Get the hell out. So Casey and I again began to consider, what do we do with our lease? How do we get out of our lease? What do we do with our kid? How do we get our life back together and get out of here? Clearly we need to. Thank God, ultimately it was Christ Church that opened its doors to me, and I'm glad that I'm here. I tell you that story, and I tell you just pieces of that story. There are other pieces that I'm not willing to tell yet. Because in that, I was so quick to say that Sam is just one of the wicked weeds in the world right now, for whatever reason. And I had such a difficult time even beginning to pray that I might find a way to forgive him for what he did to me and to my family and what he threatened to continue to do even after we left Savannah. That sometimes the only thing that I could muster was a prayer to God to help me learn how to pray for him. Eventually, one of the prayers that God, I think, whispered back to me was this: Remington, when was the last time you struggled with a mental illness? And so I would remember back to my college days when I was depressed and struggled a great deal with making it just through another day. And eventually I would drop out of college. And I remember how many of my teachers thought I was just a weed. I was just a kid who was never going to learn how to study or care enough about his career or try just a little bit harder to pick himself up and get back to work. How many people labeled me a weed and gave up on me. And I remember after dropping out of school, having some struggles with substance abuse and alcohol and not getting back into school and withdrawing, even though I tried again and again to get back into the University of Georgia. I had withdrawn so many times that they made me reapply for admission. Go figure. And I remember how many people would have given up on me if they had just known that that was my story at that time, or labeled me a weed, just another kid, too many drugs, too much alcohol, too many broken relationships, not worth paying attention to. Probably not going to amount to much. Will probably be working in this restaurant for the rest of his life. That's what I thought I was going to do. How often, because of my behavior, there was an opportunity for someone to call me a weed. And if they had, what would have happened? Had it not been for those who said, you know what, maybe in the right time, at the right place, with the right kind of care and love and attention, this person might blossom differently. I think people got me to the right place at the right time and provided the nurturing that allowed me to change who I was. Who knows whether I was a weed or wheat, but I have a sense of how I've been taken care of and cultivated. As I understand that about myself, I have to then begin to understand Sam as somebody who at the right time, in the right place, if I had the right eyes to see him or the right heart to forgive him, I might see him differently. It's as if God whispers back to me from time to time, in my eyes, in the kingdom of God, this is a seed that I planted. And no, it's not growing right now the way that I wanted it to, but nonetheless, this is a seed that I planted because I love it and because I want to see it flourish. I think that Sam is flourishing now. I think that I am too. I think that God only plants good seeds. And that what Brian Stevenson would say is so true, that as we convince ourselves more and more that we have the ability to separate the weeds from the wheat, we do more damage to our society and to ourselves than we ever do to those people that we believe are weeds. So once upon a time, the whispering back to me was, Remington, consider how often you would have considered yourself or others would have considered you a weed, and be willing to extend that grace to Sam. And now when I pray about it, so often I think that what God whispers back to me is, remember how wrong you were about that lantana? That's how wrong you might be about Sam and about anybody else in this world that you believe is not my child. At the end of our passage today, Jesus says to his disciples that at the end of the age, God will finally exact perfect justice and separate the weed from the wheat. And all, he says, causes of sin will be cast into the fire. I once believed that Jesus was saying that his justice would mean that all people who were evil in this world would also be cast into this fire, and I'm not so sure anymore. The more I think about it, the more I believe that at the end of the age, we will be able to see that God has only ever cast good seed, and that if we were finally free of all the things that God will cast into the fire, of addiction and racism and sin and brokenness and injustice, inequality, dishonesty, if we're finally free of jealousy and coveting, all those things that twist us ever so slightly, that every one of us will finally be able to stand upright as the children of God that we are. That even those people who have done the most wrong in this world and are the easiest to call weeds will be seen for what they are, in fact. Children of God, shining as righteous ones like the sun in the Father's kingdom. I pray that when we get there, we will all have eyes to see what God's redemption has wrought in this world. I pray that we will have hearts to know and ears to hear. Amen.